Welcome to Serving on Groups that Make Decisions, How to Use that Data on a Decision-Making Group. This is the third webinar of our Serving on Groups series, which are parts of the START Parent Leadership Development Training Project. This project is funded by the New Jersey Department of Children and Families, Division of Family and Community Partnerships Race to the Top Early Learning Challenge Grant. We would like to thank all of our funders for this opportunity. I would also like to thank the START team who worked so hard to put this webinar together today. Next slide. So let's meet our presenters. Presenting today, we have Michelle Tyler and Monique Duget. Managing the polls, we have Miriam Aliso, and managing questions, we have Tatiana DeGrosso. Behind the scenes, we have Debbie Esposito, and I am Brenda Figueroa. Next slide. This is our third webinar in this series. Links to the previous recorded webinars can be found on our website. The next two webinars will be on September 29th and October 13th, with the September 29th webinar being in Spanish. For more information, just call us at SPAN at the number or email that's displayed there. Thank you. Next slide. Now, we would like to acknowledge the Serving on Groups that Make Decisions curriculum used in today's webinar and to recognize the following individuals for their contributions to the development of the Serving on Groups that Make Decisions, a guide for families. This guidebook is a collaborative effort between statewide agencies, school representatives, and family members. It is a tool to help build leadership skills in families and other individuals who are interested in and are currently serving on decision-making groups. It was developed in Wisconsin as part of the Wisconsin Department of Public Instruction State Personnel Development Grant in partnership with Wisconsin Family Assistance Center for Education, Training, and Support, LLC, and the Wisconsin Statewide Parent Educator Initiative. This publication will help you identify the purposes of groups and become confident about your role in such a group. The guide will introduce you to common processes and tools that groups use to make decisions together. It will show you how to organize your skills and bring the voice of a parent or family member to the table. This is the second edition of the Trainer's Manual. Besides the guidebook and trainer manual, there is also a website, www.servingongroups.org, where anyone can go to register for upcoming webinars, view an introductory video of the guidebook, take part of online modules, and download individual sections of the guidebook in English or Spanish. And now, Miriam?
Thank you, Brenda. So now we are ready for our first poll. Let's see who is in the room today, who is on the webinar right now. So the first question for the poll is, I am attending as a, select one of the following: parent member of my county council for young children, parent caregiver, not a CCYC member, CCYC coordinator or staff person, or community partner. So use your cursor, please click on the answers and we will display the results. So far, 63% of you have voted. Let's keep it open for a couple of seconds more. 74%. And okay. So let's close the poll and let's share results. Okay, 90% of you are parents, members of your county council for young children. 6% parent caregiver, not a CCYC member. 31% are CCYC coordinator or staff person. And 44%, the majority of you, are community partners. So thank you and welcome to the webinar. Michelle Tyler.
Thanks so much, Miriam. So all groups use data. In this section will be an introduction to understanding data as information within decision-making groups. So in this webinar, we're going to go over the 8 stages of data that is used in a decision-making group. So there's lots of different terms that I'll be talking about, and Monique also when she presents, and it might be new to some of you. So let's go ahead and get started. So what is data? Data, most simply, is factual information. So when a decision-making group uses data to make decisions, they are basing their decisions on fact, not guesswork and not feelings. This is called data-based decision-making. So data doesn't just apply to more formal groups. It's also used by all kinds of groups, and it can be used in many different forms. Data must be reliable, which means that the data is accurate and true every time. So you would ask yourself, would the same results in the data be the same if someone else collected it? For it to be valid, that means that the data reflects the truth and produces the desired results. So in other words, does the data measure what it claims to measure? And then also, is it accessible? So all concerns, needs, and abilities of the audience needs to be considered when using data. So for example, imagine if I was a high school principal and I claimed to the school board that I have evidence that the parents of this school loves all of our school programs. Well, if the board chair asked me, how can I make such a claim? I could respond by saying, well, I have hard data that shows the conclusion based on my assertion, specifically a survey that I took at last winter's band banquet. Well, the board chair could then in turn say and respond that because that event was only attended by 5% of the school's parents, and the parents who attended that event had one thing in common, they all had a child that was in the band, my conclusions would be unreliable. And the board chair would be right in saying that. So for me to claim that such a small and select sample accurately represents the views of all the school parents, it's not reliable, that's not valid, and it's not accessible data. So on the next slide, when we're referring to confidentiality, we're looking at a set of rules or promises that a person makes to limit access or put restrictions on a certain type of information. So it is very important to always state if certain information should stay within the group and not be shared with others. And also we need to make sure that everyone in the group understands this. So let's just talk about some different forms of data. So on the next slide, we're looking at quantitative data as compared to qualitative data. Quantitative data deals with numbers. It's data that can be measured, length, width, weight, time, ages, etc. So when you think of quantitative data, think of quantity. So qualitative data, on the other hand, deals with descriptions. That's data that cannot be observed, that can be observed but not measured. So that's like colors, textures, smells, beauty, things like that. So when you think of qualitative data, think of quality. So let me give you an example. When we think of weather, quantitative data is the exact temperature, barometric pressure, wind speed, etc. But when we think of qualitative data and weather, it's a little bit more subjective. Is it partly cloudy? Is it windy or calm? Cool, warm? It describes what's observed or what's felt. So now we have a poll. Now we want a poll to see how your group uses data. Miriam?
Thank you, Michelle. So we have our next poll, and here it is. Do you currently use data for action planning or decision making in your group? Select one of the following: always, sometimes, never. So I'm going to keep the poll open for a few seconds to see what your responses are. So far, 60% of you have voted. Okay, let's close the poll at this time. 70% of you voted. And your results are, as you see, always 50%, sometimes 29%, never 21%. So now let's hear from Monique Dujoux, who will be talking about stages of using data.
Thank you, Miriam. Good morning, everyone. Understanding data is information. It's really key to understand that data use includes both searching for answers to questions and storytelling. When we do both, as a group, we need to really dig deep and allow the results to not only have a voice, but to tell a story. So today, you will be introduced to the 8 stages that help make sure a decision-making group is effectively using data to inform its decisions. Using data in a decision-making group is a process, and it has multiple steps or stages. So the following slides are going to describe each of the 8 stages decision-making groups are in when they use data to help make sure that they make sound decisions and that they take action. Next slide. Before we get started talking about those stages, you may have received an email prior to this webinar that had a couple of tools. And perhaps you have downloaded those, perhaps you have reviewed them and become familiar, or you might have an opportunity to look through the handouts after this. But we have provided a tool that people may use to help work through the stages of data use. This tool can be used individually in your personal life or as a decision or in a decision-making group to help in using data effectively to make really well-informed decisions. So let's get started. Next slide. Thank you. The first stage of data is planning and preparing to use data. And this first step in working with data is to plan and to prepare by asking questions. The group really needs to reflect and plan before any data is even collected. Next slide. All data planning needs to start with a question. What do we need to know? This will help focus the data search, and it really keeps the group on track. You might want to ask focusing questions. That will help pinpoint the information that you need to be able to make an informed decision and to take action. You want to use a variety of methods and sources in order to gain the information that you are looking for. You need to find data that's already out there because you need to create a baseline. All data will not, or that story will not just come out of new data. It may come out of data that you already have. And you need to try to find the gaps in information found in the current data and pinpoint the possible roadblocks in finding information and figure out how to overcome them. Next slide. Stage 2 of data use is collecting the data. Data should be collected. The data collected needs to be specific. It has to be relative and relevant to the work of the group. And the group can collect the data themselves, or the data can be collected by someone else. For example, next slide. Schools are full of data. You can get data through student learning data, which is about the schoolwork and the assessments of an individual student. There's data in schools about the process, and that provides information about school management, administration, structure, and the general workings of the school. Now, schools can use families as a source of data. They can ask you to fill out surveys and ask you specific questions about information that they may be trying to find answers to in order to create new programs or find curriculum that they think is appropriate for their students' success. They may also convene focus groups as a way to find out specific data from specific groups of people. However, it is really important for schools to communicate for families. And if that's not done, for families to ask the question why you are collecting the data that I'm providing and what will be done with that data. Other examples of educational data sources where we can find data can be through classwork, homework and progress reports, income and expense reports. There's a number of ways to create the data that we are looking for in order to tell the story. Michelle?
Thanks so much, Monique. All right, so now we're going to look at the third stage of data, which is organizing the data that you receive. So the organizing of it is going to help people to understand it. So on the next slide, we're going to look at two different ways of organizing data. One is aggregated, and the other one is disaggregated. Most data is first shown as aggregated data. So when you have aggregated data, you look at the total of all the data from the whole group, which is going to give you the big picture. The big picture view of data is especially useful in sharing information with audiences, such as your governing body or for annual reports to the public. I was so happy to hear that 50% of you out there are already using data in your groups. And hopefully, as we go through the rest of this discussion, the other 50% will be doing it more also. So as you look at disaggregated data, that means looking at the results or scores from the whole or larger group and breaking it into smaller groups so that you can get more and more details. So when you disaggregate data, you can dig deeper and deeper. For example, look at the graphs in front of you. Both graphs look at youth who are not working, but the disaggregated data digs deeper, and it looks at the section of youth that are not working to answer the questions of the amount of youth that are not working, also by if they have received a high school diploma or not, and then also looking at their racial and ethnic identity. Sometimes disaggregated data can surprise you. So disaggregated data can also help you to decide and prioritize your action plan. And we're going to talk about an action plan later in the stages also. So on the next slide, another way of organizing your data is through triangulated data. Triangulated data means that the group looks at or compares 3 or more different sources of data that applies to the same person or subject. So they do this to see if the information from one source supports information from other sources. Comparing data from different sources can also provide a lot more insight. So for example, a college admission process, they want to know the whole picture of the student. They want to know, is the student ready to attend their school? So instead of making a decision just looking at that grade point average of the student, triangulated data would also include the student's volunteer hours, extracurricular activities, essays, application form, etc. So on the next slide, another way of organizing data is we want to make sure that it's easy to understand. So we can look at tips for interpreting graphs. We want to make sure that we're looking at formats and tables and charts and spreadsheets that's going to give you a better visual representation of the data. So remember, when you're looking at graphs like this and charts like this, you want to read the labels presented on the graph or the table. So you want to also ask yourself, what is in each column? What does each row represent? What are the range of values from one part of the bar graph to another? Also, are there any large changes or any growth or any less changes in other areas? All right, so another way of organizing data is a snapshot in time. So the next slide shows that a snapshot in time for 2012 post-high school student outcomes. So in this example, it's a pie chart. And the pie chart shows that snapshot, and you always have to make sure that the pie chart totals 100% when looking at any sort of data through a pie chart. So another way of organizing the data that you collect is also using comparisons in organizing that data. So you can compare the relationship and the value and the relationship between several variables. So studying this data can also help you to draw different conclusions. So let's look at the example in front of us. This bar graph displays the elementary school students' enrollment in the 2012 to 13 school year. So looking at the amount of students per grade can help guide different decisions that you're going to make. You would need to know maybe how many teachers or how many classrooms that you're going to need. If there's 20 kids in a classroom and you have 96 children in a K-4 classroom, how many K-4 classrooms are you going to need? How many books are you going to need? Computers, other supplies, etc. So that's very useful in that sort of, in getting that information. So now if we look at the next slide with trends, another way of looking at data, we can compare data over a period of time, and we're hoping to see some type of trend in that data. So that this way you can make predictions about the future. Now you need to begin with the baseline data so that you can track the progress after that baseline towards the goals over time. So when data from multiple periods of time are displayed, we can see that the trend and also see possibly what could happen in the future and make predictions. So just to summarize a little bit, or to give you different tips on organizing data, on the next slide we see that we can look at data from sources we must look at data from trusted sources in order to obtain the information. We want to follow up with questions to make sure the data is accurate and understood. We need to use many different ways of gathering data so that we know that we're getting accurate information, and also make sure the group agrees and accepts the findings of the data that you received. So I just shared a lot of information about data, and I just want to pause for a minute while Miriam presents another poll looking that information over. Miriam?
Thank you, Michelle. Yes, we are ready for our third poll, which is, the question is, what type of data would you request if you need to dissect data that you already received? Select one of the following: triangulated, aggregated, disaggregated, bar graph. So I'm going to wait for a couple of seconds to see your responses. I can see it's a little bit more difficult. And yes, but you are voting. Thank you. Thank you. 50% of you have voted so far. Okay, let's keep it open for a couple of seconds more. Yeah. Okay, so 59% of you have voted. Let's 68. Thank you so much. I'm going to close the poll. Thank you. And let's see the results. Okay. So 19% of you said triangulated. 19% said aggregated. 50% said disaggregated. And 13% said bar graph. Okay. The correct response is disaggregated. So half of you were right. And by the way, these polls are examples of aggregated data. This is about the big picture. So let's go back to Michelle.
All right, thanks so much, everyone. Thanks, Miriam, and for everyone participating in the poll. I know that this is a lot of new information for everyone, and we want to just make sure that you understand the reasons behind getting this data and how you can look at it. So let's look at analyzing the data. So after collecting and analyzing data, the next steps, after collecting the data, and analyzing and organizing it, the next step is to analyze it. So this means thinking about what the data means and the patterns in it. So analyzing data is not a simple process, and the group may have to look at data in several different ways in order to make any decisions. So on the next slide, when we're looking at analyzing data, you're looking for similarities, differences, trends, and other relationships that may show information or tell a story. So each view of the data provides a unique insight, making it important to look at the data from many different viewpoints. And only after studying the data do patterns become apparent. So during the steps of analyzing data, it may be possible to begin describing the findings of the data as strengths and challenges. So strengths are results of the data that show success, and challenges are results showing areas where we need to focus, where a need needs to be focused. So remember, don't draw conclusions too soon. You don't want to skew the analyzing of the data. When finding and recording data, you must always remind yourself to record information as it appears in the data source, and to avoid analyzing the information too early. So let's look at some terms when we're working with numbers. So on the next slide, there are some terms that may be unfamiliar terms, but they will come up when you're analyzing data. So you need to make sure that you understand them. So analyzing numbers can be done a few different ways. Depending on how it's done, results can be very different. So calculating the mean, the median, the mode, and the range for a series of numbers can help you in analyzing data. But first we have to know what those words mean. So the mean is the average of the numbers. The median is the middle value. When I put all the numbers in order from smallest to largest, that is usually the best way to show a data sample is by showing the median. The mode is the most frequent value of the numbers that shows up in the data sample. And the range is the difference between the lowest and the highest value. Another term that we use when analyzing data with numbers is an outlier. An outlier is either the very high or very low number that can kind of distort the average, and it really leads to more discussion and more questions. A term that may come up in discussions around data is the term called statistically significant. Statistically significant, say that 3 times fast, means that the data results are probably true and not because of chance. So on the next slide, we're going to look at some examples of this. So this is a graph of January reading scores. So for example, Mrs. Smith looks at her students' reading scores 5 times a year. And in this graph, showing the reading scores of her students in January on the left. So reading scores are based on a scale from 0 to 1800. So looking at the data on this graph, the mean is the average of those numbers. The median is the middle number. So in this case, like I said, we place the numbers in order and pick the one that's in the middle. The mode is the number which shows up in the data more than once. In this case, that's 880 would be the mode. It shows up twice. And the range is the difference between the highest number and the lowest number. So you would take 1,070 and 405, and the difference would be the 665. Now on the right, we have a graph of student A's reading scores. So looking at the graph of student A's reading scores, we can ask a few questions. Since the outlier was in November, where the reading scores increased by 400 points in 2 months, you can ask yourself, well, why did that happen? And then by the time January rolled around, student A's scores lowered again, but then showed steady progress throughout the rest of the year. So was November's reading materials of higher interest? Was it something more familiar to the student? All these are questions that you would ask looking at this graph. Could the dip in January be due to the fact that the student wasn't feeling well, or maybe just uninterested in the testing materials? Remember, each score is just a snapshot of the student's progress at that time, so one just doesn't know. However, we also need to look at the big picture. The student made progress during the year, and that's what you should also take away from looking at that data. So Miriam, can you share with everyone a question about analyzing data?
Yes, sure. Thank you, Michelle. So we are ready for our next poll. And let's see. The question is, when analyzing data, which term below describes the middle value? Select one of the following: mode, range, mean, or median. So take your time and cast your vote. Okay, so I'm going to leave the poll open for a few more seconds. So far, 59% of you have voted. Okay. That's a nice question to review the material that Michelle has been presenting. Okay. 73% of you have voted. I'm going to close the poll right now. And let's share the results here. Okay, 6% of you said mode. None of you said range. 25% of you said mean. And 69% of you said median. So you were paying attention. That's the right answer, median. Congratulations, and let's continue with Michelle.
Well, now we're going to go to questions. So, Tatiana, are there any questions that anyone has?
Michelle, at this time, I do not see any questions. I do encourage everyone to actively participate in today's webinar, and please post your questions in the question box, as well as you can raise your hand and be unmuted to post your question verbally. I have received a couple of suggestions from our audience members today. I'm asking for the PowerPoint presentation to be shared in the PDF format, and we will absolutely do that in the email to everybody, in which we'll include a recording to today's webinar, and the handouts and the PowerPoint will be also shared in the PDF format.
Thank you so much, Tatiana. Wow. Well, we've shared, we've analyzed the data, we have successfully completed stage 1 through 4, and now we need to look at the data to try to figure out why and possible next steps. So when we're developing a hypothesis, which is stage 5, we are now developing hypothesis and making recommendations. We have to explain what that data represents that we've gathered and why it looks the way it does. We have to then decide what recommendations to make based on the data and the way that it looks. Next slide. So data can tell what is happening, but it doesn't tell why. And so the more that we analyze and understand the data, the better our conclusions and solutions are likely to be. In this stage, we have to try to figure out the why. So we first have to try to understand why something might be happening, and we can do that by possibly brainstorming possible ideas based on the data. We could possibly put together a focus group to ask the very people that this is affecting why this may be happening. We have to look at other data. We have to see if this data helps support our ideas or not. And if you're still not sure, we need to ask those additional questions about data that Michelle referred to earlier. Your questions may help clear up why something might be happening. Don't ever think that any question is silly and that you should not ask it. Anything can really create a great hypothesis and provide the opportunity to make an absolutely awesome recommendation. The group must agree upon the conclusions drawn from analyzing the data before any recommendations are made. Again, we move forward in agreement. And once you know why something is happening, we can figure out possible solutions. I have to caution you, however, it is very important to emphasize the importance of not jumping to conclusions too quickly. Dig deep. Take your time. Look at all of the data that may be available or new data that you are currently gathering. The group must avoid assumptions, which creates a misinterpretation and misrepresentation of the data. Next slide. Stage 6 is creating an action plan. And that's making something happen after we have looked at our hypothesis and recommendation. This is when we get to work. This is when we put things into action. So in order to do that, we have to look at a variety of data and often, as I've mentioned, create that action plan. That action plan can help us improve and actually encounter less challenges as we move forward. And an action plan usually includes your goals, what steps you are taking to get to those goals. It assigns roles and responsibilities to the group. It also has deadlines that people need to be responsible and accountable for. Some action plans will occur over a short period of time and may have quick evaluations, and other action plans may take longer and may require more time to put in place based on what that may be. This is also a working document. You can go back and look at what you're doing if you find that some of your deadlines or some of your goals are not achieved. Again, this needs to be clear and concise. Next slide. The key steps in creating a positive and successful effective action plan is that you need to bring key people together to design this action plan. Who needs to be at the table? Who is this affecting? Who is going to have the greatest impact? And who are the other key players that need to be involved to make this happen? It's a simple thing of what action or change will occur, who will carry it out, when will it take place and for how long, where will it happen, what resources do we need in order to be successful, and what type of communication, who should know what we are doing. This is a plan that can be reviewed periodically, changed. It should be followed through by using a timeline and setting up deadlines. It is a great opportunity to keep track of your progress and monitor what is happening or what may not be happening. And it also provides the opportunity to see your successes and to celebrate what you have accomplished and the great impact that you may have made on families or community. Next slide. Here is another tool that can really help create success for your group or for you individually. It's an example of an action plan template. Again, this is something that was emailed to you prior to the webinar, and also it is a tool that you can find in your handouts. It's a great tool to use to develop an effective action plan based on the hypothesis and the recommendations from Stage 5. We're going to take a moment now and pause. And Miriam, I understand you have another poll for us.
Thank you, Monique. Yes, I do have another poll, and this summarizes what you have been explaining about creating an action plan. So this is our last poll for the day. And the question is, an action plan works best when, select one of the following. Resources are identified, progress is tracked, everyone is involved in plan development and sharing tasks, the plan is reviewed, or all of the above. So cast your vote, and I will share your responses in a few. So 63 have voted so far. Let's keep it open for a couple of seconds so everybody has a chance to cast their vote and see what you have learned. All right, so 6% of you said everyone is involved in plan development and sharing tasks, and 94 of you said all of the above, which is the right answer. Congratulations, and let's go back to Michelle, who will discuss steps number 7 and 8 of data use.
Thanks so much, Miriam. So, we've talked about a lot of things as far as data so far, and some people would think that you can stop at doing that action plan. But these next two stages are extremely important also. You need to make sure that you're displaying and sharing your results. When people from different perspectives look at data, they might make new conclusions, and they may have new ways of looking at those changes. This is how sharing data can be so useful. So on the next slide, we can look at how the group needs to present the information found in the data in a way that it's easy for the audience to understand. So you want to make sure that your report is appealing. Keep it simple and clear and also visually attractive. You need to make sure it's accessible. Use a reading level accessible to all of your audience. Avoid jargon and acronyms that the audience doesn't understand. It's nice sometimes to use bullet lists to list your information, and then also a language that's spoken by the audience members. You also want to make sure that the data that you're displaying for everyone is accurate. Data must be free of errors. The report must be about what the data actually says and not what you wish it would have said. And it needs to be audience specific. Focus on the issues that the audience cares about. Look at the level of details needed by the audience and what the audience already knows. So you also want to be fair and objective. Use data to drive decision making. It may tempt you to make a decision and then search only for the data that supports that decision. But don't do that. Such selective choosing of data is unethical and it's not useful. Okay, so on the next slide, just to talk about sharing those results. A lot depends on the audience when figuring out what, how, and even when to share the data. Different audiences need different views of the data. So as a report of the data, and the results is written, think about the following questions. What's the purpose of your report? Does it need to provide information or to raise awareness? Will it be used for decision making? Other questions you can look at is what information is new and surprising in the data that you have? And what does the audience already know about that topic? What level of information do they need? Do they need the big picture? Or do you need to make sure that it's disaggregated and there's lots of details? Be sure to share the results with your group. Decide where this data will be shared. Consider sharing it with families at school board meetings, district websites or in a newsletter, community newspapers, parent groups or meetings. Just remember, don't just share it in your group meetings. Share it widely as it needs to be. So in the next slide, we're going to just talk about different ways that you can make that data come alive as you're presenting it and sharing it with others. So one way is a social math. A social math is about painting a picture with the data. Sometimes numbers are just numbers when there's no content. If there's nothing familiar there, then it just looks like numbers. A social math is all about relating the data numbers to what's familiar to your audience. It brings numbers down to earth by blending them in with compelling stories and providing comparisons with familiar things. It works by analogy. So for example, if you're looking at the infographic to the left, then the earth would help you think about how the data affects you globally. And then the pencils, that relates to education. And then when you look at the homes in the graphic, it connects the data to community. Another way to bring the data alive is by data stories. Data stories are being used more and more to explain and visualize information that is collected and analyzed. Behind every data example is a story just waiting to be told. Here are some strategies on telling a good story that apply to data visualizations. Find the compelling narrative. Think about your audience and what they know about the topic. Be objective and offer a balance. Don't censor the data in the visualization. And then also edit and try to really explain the data. Okay, so on the next slide, we're going to look at the last stage of data use, continuous monitoring for progress and improvement. So dealing with data doesn't end with just creating an action plan. It's really only the beginning. A good data practice involves continuously collecting and evaluating data to make sure that progress is made. So on the next slide, groups should regularly revisit the action plan, which was developed as a result of the data that you received. So the group should regularly visit and check in with one another, identify any challenges, make changes as needed, and of course, remember to celebrate the successes. So when checking to find out if an action plan is working, the group must collect the same type of data from the same data sources that they used in the beginning of the data cycle. When data is collected from different sources, differences in how the data was collected could lead to different results. So just to give an example, the monitoring is similar to how you monitor an individual education program. The action plan is like your IEP. So you must check the IEP to measure progress in case there's any changes that need to be made, and then also make those adjustments. It's not a one and done. It's a living, breathing document. So like an IEP, it's a document that needs to be reviewed because so many elements can change the data and as time changes, people, environments changes, etc. So just to look over that continuous monitoring and progress again on the next slide, sometimes looking at how well the action plan is working leads to new questions and also leads to obtaining new data. So effective continuous progress monitoring often addresses questions such as, to what extent was the initial question asked and answered? What are new concerns or questions that we've come up with? Which factors are clearly understood and which ones need more information? And has the situation improved by the action plan and the hypothesis that you put together? So monitoring for progress and improvement gives group members a chance to see the results of their hard work. When groups see good things happening in education based on their decisions, their drive to keep working at it is renewed. If things are not working as planned, the group can revisit their questions and the data in order to adjust their plan. So we've given a lot of information, so I'd like to pause for a minute and see if there are any questions. Tatiana?
Thank you, Michelle. I do not see any questions for our presenters, but there is a lot of chat going on in the background, and I wanted to send a shout out to Deidre, who said that she is participating on today's webinar with 3 other parents and 4 professionals, and all in the same room, and all of them are CCYC members. So thank you very much for your participation on today's webinar. In addition, I wanted to...
I do have one question from an attendee. Elizabeth Davidson has her hand up. Elizabeth, did you have a question?
Yes, I wanted to find out what the best way is to incorporate this into a meeting. The skill building activities that you would use to really bring out this information for the parents so they could actually get hands-on experience in doing this kind of thing.
Okay, I'm going to go ahead and mute you again, and maybe Michelle, you'd like to address that? Michelle?
I'm sorry, I was muted. If it's okay, if you can unmute her, because I do have a question. So you're saying that how could you use a skill building activity to help parents in collecting data? Is that your question?
Yes. How do you a skill building activity? What is a skill building activity that you could use in the meetings to bring this type of information to it? So once this information is given, skill building activities for them to actually get their hands on data so that they understand how to actually work with it. They have to build their skills, in doing this. So during the meetings, what type of skill building activities do you have?
Can I answer that, Michelle?
Let me say one little part, and then please do, Monique, because your input with the council would be great with that. I just want to say that one of the activities that I know that we've done in the past is that we've related it to data that we use in everyday life. So when you're building those skills with people who feel as though, well, this data is not really something I'm used to doing, but when you say, okay, what about the data on something that you want to change in your life? So what do you need to do? Are you trying to exercise more? What does that mean? How are you going to increase it? How are you going to take data on what that increase looks like? So there's an activity that we used in one of our in-persons that really, and that information is on our website, that really breaks down how to use activities that parents use every day in the data that they're collecting so it can be more relatable. But Monique, please add.
And that's an excellent answer, Michelle. With the Essex County Council for Young Children, whenever we meet for our monthly, we have what we call a team building activity. And that activity is generally around something that will help develop skills that the group, the parents, and the stakeholders that all are involved within this team will have to need in order to move forward to identify where the need is in the community based on the various forms of data and the way that they collect it. So that type of activity that Michelle just spoke of in regards to looking into team building activities that can go from first personal to how do we expand that now, how do we as a group collect data. Those are the type of activities that can then lead into that understanding and developing the tools that you need when you are ready to identify how to identify what your priorities are, and then taking that information out to create a change.
Thank you, Monique. We do have another question. It's coming from Marie, and her question is, do local community colleges offer courses on data analysis? It is not an easy task.
And I really appreciate that question because it's not an easy task. Sometimes as soon as I say data, I start rolling in the back of people's heads, and they're just not, it just the thought of it and the numbers puts people off. I couldn't tell you if there are courses at local community colleges, but there are in the next couple of slides some great resources online. I don't know if there's anyone else here on the staff that could offer any information as far as community colleges.
I don't have information on community colleges, but I just want to, I don't want people to be scared about data. A lot of the data that we're talking about is available, and we will discuss the resources at the end of the webinar. I mean, you can go to Kids Count if you have questions about, for example, chronic absenteeism. That's something that's affecting us, and it affects literacy scores. It affects a lot of aspects of our kids' achievement. So if you have questions about chronic absenteeism, that kind of information is available on the Kids Count website. It's available on the Department of Education website. So a lot of this data is already available, and many of it is available in the form of infographics, which are very accessible and easy to understand. So just because, so when you hear the word data, we shouldn't necessarily get scared or think that this is above us. This is something that is accessible, and you can approach your parent engagement specialist, parent group specialist on the START project. If your team, if your group is interested in using data, we can certainly sit down with you and talk about how you might want to use it in your group. But it's not something that is inaccessible, definitely, to anybody that's here. So
Okay.
Monique?
Real quick, if I may please post another question for our presenters. This one is coming from Deb. She's asking for specific examples to share with, I guess, examples of specific team building activities to share with her team, decision-making team.
That's a very good question, and if you're interested in that, you can send an email to Diane Malley. Her contact information is at the end of the webinar, and a parent group specialist or parent engagement specialist, from your region will be happy to get back with you and discuss activities and specific activities that you can use with your group.
And we have questions coming in, and let me know if we have time for another one.
We're at 12:56 now, so we should probably just wrap it up. If you have any more questions, we can address them at the end. But first, I want to make sure we get through all the resources and the final information that we have. But I'd be happy to stick around a little bit after the webinar and answer any questions. Okay?
Great.
Monique?
Now we will continue with Monique.
Okay, great. Wow, those questions are coming in.
And that's great.
This is what data does. It either makes your head spin or it gives an opportunity to provide a lot of questions. So really great to all of those that have, to all of you that have so many questions out there. So it's obvious that using data in a decision-making group is a process with multiple steps and stages and we've just gone through the 8 stages that help make sure decision-making groups are effectively using the data to inform the decisions. And if you find that you are not, I know that there was a question in regards to a community college, and Debbie is right. It doesn't take all of that. Some of this is just repetitive, it's understanding, and we have provided you through this webinar and through our handouts some amazing tools, hands-on, that can really walk anyone through this process, and anyone can become very successful in gathering data just by using these stages. It's 8. Planning and preparing to use data. Pinpoint the information you need. Collecting data. You have to gather new and already collected data. Organizing data. Analyzing data. Don't forget to develop that hypothesis and make recommendations. That will start you on action. That will help you create your action plan. And you have to make the plan to get something done. You're then going to show others the data and create future plans by displaying and sharing your results. And you will continuously monitor your plan for progress and improvement. Because as Michelle said, this is a working document where all things can change. And once you have created that impact that you are looking for, you will move on to your next action. We have found that data is used every day by groups making decisions on behalf of students, families, schools, communities, and when reliable data is used responsibly, it can lead to improved outcomes for all. Next slide. By creating the action plan, that will tell you the what, the who, the when, the where, the what, and who should know what. And again, we have provided these tools for you within our handouts. We hope that you use these. These are very effective, and I am saying that personally because we have had a lot of success in using these very same tools within the Essex County Council for Young Children, and has really created a great path as we move forward within our county to be successful for all the families that are within Essex County. Next slide.
Michelle.
Michelle.
Yes, thanks so much, Monique. So we've provided some great resources and handouts that you can download, but here are just some additional resources that's going to help you in collecting data. So I'd like to call to your attention, though, just a couple of them, which is the fact sheets in your community. That's the second resource on the left-hand side. You can get information disaggregated by race, by income, sex, etc. So that's a really good one to look at. And then another one that I want to call to your attention is the U.S. Census Bureau Quick Facts Link data. So in that one, you can compare a variety of topics and also see data organized in a variety of ways. Now, the next slide, the resources that we have are more so specific to our project. So, of course, we talked about this webinar series was through the Serving on Groups That Makes Decisions, the Guide for Families. So you can always go there, the guidebooks, you can download information or download the guidebook to get a lot of great information. That's a great resource. It comes in English and Spanish. The second one there and the third one, both of those links you can go to see upcoming events from the START project and also the Council Parent Leadership Development Trainings. So you can get information on both of those links there. And then, of course, the SPAN, which is the Statewide Parent Advocacy Network, as your first stop for information and resources. So we have the phone number there and then also the website that you can go to get more information. Brenda?
Thank you, Michelle. Next slide. So we would like to remind you again that our next two webinars will be on September 29th and October 13th, with the September 29th being our Spanish webinar. For more information, just call us at SPAN 973-642-8100, extension 123, or you can always email us at start@spannj.org. Please share with your contacts. Next slide. At the close of the webinar, you will receive an evaluation about this webinar. Please take a moment to fill it out. We use your feedback when creating new events and providing additional resources to the families, group leaders, and educators. And we would like to thank you for attending this webinar. We hope you've enjoyed it, and have a great afternoon. Thanks, everybody.